So we're picking up in chapter 26 with responding to Western imperialism. In other words, how did people feel about it? And so we're starting with a pattern of response. And of course, Western expansion was extremely disruptive assault on Africa and Asia that threatened local economies and existing ways of life. And initially, the response of African and Asian rulers was to resist this aggressive Western expansion and to try to drive the foreigners away. But of course, the superior military technology of the industrialized West always prevailed. And so you can kind of think of it, the responses to the Western impact as a spectrum. And you have the traditionalists who wanted to preserve their culture at all costs at one end, and then the westernizers on the other who wanted to westernize, who wanted to modernize. But when the power of both of the traditionals and the modernizers was pretty much crushed by superior force, most Asians and Africans resolved to accept imperial rule because they really didn't have any other option. And so the masses were pretty much used to doing what their rulers told them. And so the Europeans, who were clothed in power, governed pretty smoothly and effectively because, again, the people were used to doing what they were told. But support for European rule among these conquered masses was shallow and weak. And there arose this group who opposed the Europeans called the nonconformists. And eventually they would be the anti-imperialist leaders who felt that human dignity was completely incompatible with foreign rule. And ironically, they would use the Western world ideologies like liberalism, the talk of civil liberty and political self-determination and modern nationalism to justify their protest. And of course, after 1917, another one of their weapons against Western rule would be Lenin's version of Marxian socialism. So, empire in India. So, India, of course, was the jewel of the British Empire and had been ruled more or less absolutely by Great Britain since the British East India Company had conquered the last independent native states in 1848. And so after 1858, India was ruled by the British Parliament in London following a rebellion that was pretty much crushed by the British Army. And so after 1858, India was ruled directly by Parliament in London and administered by a small, all-white civil service in India. And although the British white elite, of course backed by white officers and native troops, was competent and usually well-disposed toward the welfare of the Indian peasant masses, they practiced really strict job discrimination and social segregation. After the Suez Canal was opened in 1869, making travel to India much easier, many of the British civil servants brought their families with them to live in India. And they tended to live in their own separate communities where they had large houses, well-shaded porches, beautiful lawns, and multitudes of servants. And many of the officials' wives actually loved their duties and carried them out very well, managing complex households with the same confident authoritarianism that pretty much characterized British political rule in India. There was, though, a small minority of British women, most of them feminists or missionaries or social reformers, who wanted to help improve the lives of Indian women, both Hindu and Muslims, through education and legislation. And spurred on by strong feelings of racial and cultural superiority, they acted quickly to introduce many good changes to India, establishing, for example, a modern system of secondary education. And through education and government service, the British offered some Indians excellent opportunities for economic and social advances. In addition to this, the British created a unified powerful state where Hindus, Muslims, and other ethnic groups were pretty much placed under the same general system of law and administration. But despite that, there was a reaction to European rule that resulted in the rise of nationalism among the Indian elite. Because the best jobs, the top clubs, the modern hotels were pretty much completely sealed off to the Indians. And for the well-educated English-speaking elite, this was a bitter injustice of racial discrimination that contradicted Western concepts of human rights and equality. So in 1885, many of the educated Indians came together and found the Indian National Congress, and they began to demand equality and self-government. The example of Japan. And we've already talked about how in 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Japan with his crude yet effective gunboat diplomacy, basically forcing Japan to trade with us. And when he arrived, Japan was pretty much a complex feudal society. And the intensely proud samurai, who were a warrior nobility, were pretty much humiliated by this intrusion of Americans and their unequal treaties with Western countries. So the foreigners, as they began to settle in Yokohama, the radical samurai began this wave of anti-foreign terrorism and anti-government assassinations between 1858 and 1863. And so it took an allied fleet of American, British, Dutch, and French warships to respond by demolishing key forts, which further weakened the power and the prestige of the shogun's government. And so in 1867, there was a coalition led by patriotic samurai who seized control of the government and restored the power of the emperor in the Meiji Restoration. And this was actually a good thing. This is not the old samurai who were prideful and then humiliated with American intrusion. These were younger, more patriotic samurai. And the Meiji Restoration was a great turning point for Japan. And so to deal with immediate foreign threat, the young but well-trained leaders of Meiji Japan pretty much dropped the anti-foreign attacks and instead focused on a series of measures to reform Japan along modern lines. And so basically their goal at this point became to catch up with the West. And so they abolished feudalism and the aristocratic decentralized government and formed a strong unified state in 1871. And they dismantled the four-class legal system, almost like a caste system. They declared social equality. They decreed freedom of movement and created a free, competitive, government-stimulated economy. Japan began to build railroads and modern factories and adopted many principles of a free liberal society. And this resulted in modernization for Japan. And, there was an overriding concern for a powerful state and a strong military, which led to the creation of a modern navy and a modern army that were reorganized along European lines. And Japan, on top of that, borrowed rapidly and adapted skillfully to the science of the West and modern technology, especially in industry and medicine and education. So by 1890, they had pretty much decided on, a new slogan: Western science, Eastern ethics. So they sort of borrowed and selected elements of Western culture that were in keeping with Japanese tradition. So Western science, but Eastern ethics. And so one of the aspects of Eastern ethics was that they rejected democracy in favor of a powerful emperor and an authoritarian constitution. And at that point, Japan was ready to become an imperialist power itself. Japan forcibly opened Korea through gunboat diplomacy in 1876, just 23 years after they had been forcibly opened through gunboat diplomacy. and they decisively defeated China in a war over Korea in 1894 and 95. And from then on competed aggressively with the leading European powers for influence and territory in China. In 1904, Japan attacked Russia and succeeded in gaining possession of Port Arthur. And then in 1910, successfully annexed Korea. And so this really just signaled the fact that Japan had become a major imperialist world power. Toward revolution in China. So in 1860, at this point, the Qing had been ruling for 200 years in China, and it appeared that they were on the verge of collapse. They had failed to repel foreigners. They had failed to put down rebellions, and chaos racked the country. But in a surprising comeback, the traditional ruling groups temporarily produced new and effective leadership, as generals and loyal scholar statesmen quieted disturbances like the Taiping Rebellion. And the Empress Dowager, I don't know that I should even try to say her name, Zushi, maybe, I don't know. But she put forth shrewd insight with action and was able to revitalize the bureaucracy. This allowed the dynasty to try to adopt some aspects of Western government and technology while maintaining traditional Chinese values and beliefs, sort of like what we talked about with Japan, Western science, Eastern ethics. But this movement toward domestic reform and some cooperation with the West ended up collapsing under a harsh treaty that followed China's defeat in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 and 95. We just mentioned that the Japanese successfully defeated China, and the peace treaty that followed made it so that their cooperation with the West and their domestic reform was not really possible. And so because China was helpless in the face of aggression, there was a rush for foreign concessions and protectorates in China. And it appeared in 1898 that the European powers might divide China up completely amongst themselves. And so China's position after war with Japan led to a renewed drive for fundamental reforms. And in 1898, modernizers convinced the young emperor to launch a very desperate 100 days of reform. And this was just an attempt to meet the foreign challenge. And so the 100 Days Reform was really a good plan to help modernize China and catch them up with the West to hopefully prevent another Sino-Japanese war. But there was a violent reaction that swept the country over talk of this 100 Days War. And it was actually encouraged by the Manchu court, and it was led by a secret society called the Boxers. And this was the name given to them by English people, maybe missionaries, but they were named Boxers because they practiced calisthenics all day long. And the Boxers thought that their exercises would make them impervious to cannon fire and bullets. And so this was called the Boxer Rebellion. And they were really attacking Christians and foreigners. That's really what the rebellion was about, Christians and foreigners. And so in northern China, more than 200 missionaries, foreign missionaries, and several thousand Chinese Christians were killed, which prompted threats and demands from Western governments. And so the Empress Dowager answered by declaring war, and she was hoping that the Boxers might relieve the foreign pressure on the Manchu dynasty. At this point, the Boxers successfully besieged the embassy quarter in Beijing, and so foreign governments eventually organized an international force of 20,000 soldiers to go into the embassy and rescue their diplomats and to punish China for treating them this way. And so Western armies, they came in, they occupied and plundered Beijing, and China was forced to accept a long list of penalties that included large indemnity payments. And so anarchy and foreign influence spread, and revolutionary groups agitated and plotted until there was actually a spontaneous uprising in 1912 that led to the fall of the Qing dynasty. And so after thousands of years of emperors and empires and dynasties, there was a loose coalition of revolutionaries who proclaimed a Western-style republic and called for an elected parliament in China. And so that brings our Chapter 26 videos to a close.